on this computer. And again, we are recording this and it will be up on our site probably this afternoon or first thing in the morning. It'll be in the blog that you'll see Barak's picture and life options with Barak Wolff, and also the brochure from his organization and also contact information. So if you would like to contact him and talk to him personally or get some more information, you'll be able to access that very easily. But again, so we've got a minute left and I want to welcome everybody here. We've got some new people that I've never seen, but we actually have a lot of people that we do see. I'm going to mute everyone. Barak, you're probably going to have to unmute yourself.
Okay.
So I'm going to do that. Yeah, you'll have to unmute yourself now. But what we're going to do is Barak will give his presentation. I will watch for people coming in and out. If you have a question, please put it into the chat. And we will get to it as we can. We're going to allow a lot of time at the very end as well for Q&A. But if you have a specific question, please feel free to put it into the chat, or you can wait till later on and you can either use the reaction of raising your hand or just physically raising your hand, and we'll try to call on you, on a timely basis. So anyway, again, I am Ann Church. I'm co-founder of Villages of Santa Fe, and this is one of our educational programs that we offer free to the public. And I want to introduce you to Barak Wolff, and he will give you the 411 on what's he do, what is he doing, and how important it is to people in Santa Fe and New Mexico. It's all yours, Barak.
Well, thank you. I'm going to start because I do have slides today. I'll go ahead and share my screen and see if get that technology to work. And then I'll see if we can get this slideshow to work. That looks good so far. And I'm going to go like this. And yeah, I think we're in business. And thanks so much as always. You are our fearless leader for those of us villagers, and it really is a pleasure to work with you. I love the competency around all the things that you do. Being here today does very much feel like my home court advantage. I've been having the opportunity to give some talks over this last 6 weeks particularly. And it's always nice to be with a group where I know some of the folks and I know the history. And also, I'm going to ask that you forgive me in advance. I have a new camera that seems to work pretty good, but I have an old computer, and sometimes they lose track of each other, so I have a little delay. So I'll beg your indulgence on that. My background, just very quickly, I'm a public health guy. I've been out here in New Mexico since 1975. I had a robust career with rural health and emergency medical services and public health broadly. I spent 3 years as a statewide division director of public health, but I retired young. And for the last 17 years, I've worked at the New Mexico legislature when they're in session. So for 30 days or 60 days, I'm the senior analyst for the Senate Health and Public Affairs Committee. And I've worked with terrific legislators, Dee Feldman for a number of years, and more recently, Jerry Ortiz-Pino, who are some of the best. And so that's kind of my background. About 2012, I got deeply involved. I started to get involved with end-of-life issues as part of my retirement service work. And it's just escalated from there, as you'll see as I go through a bit. But I wanted to start off just sort of in honor of the season and show you my very favorite Halloween picture. I just put it up there for a second because it's just too cute for words. And if I don't show it now, I don't get to see it again for another year. So thanks for indulging me. And that'll move us to somebody that many of you may have read or know about or seen on PBS, Atul Gawande, a terrific surgeon, author, and really a visionary around aging and living well and dying well. And life is meaningful because it's a story. and in stories, the endings matter. And yeah, we're going to talk some about endings today, and they certainly matter. So, but here's today's story. We're going to start by talking about our own mortality and this really powerful right to self-determination. That'll go right into advanced care planning, which many of you know about. And we've done some sessions on that. One of the first things I did after I joined Villages was set up a session, and we had about 20 folks around the table for a better part of a day talking about advanced care planning. And then end of life options, broadly speaking, because it's not just about this new one. Our emphasis is very much also on end of life options that are out there now, and people take advantage of them at times and have some choices to make. And certainly I'll drill down and talk about our new kid on the block, where we've authorized medical aid in dying through the Elizabeth Whitefield End of Life Options Act. And then just give an update on how it's going so far. Went into effect on June 18th. And, folks are taking advantage of it and learning about it. And this is part of that effort. Having the conversation that like we're going to have today is very much part of it all. This slide I've used in a number of settings where I've had 30 or 40 minutes to go through it. Really feels very generous today, and I can take a little more time and still leave a good bunch of time for discussion and questions. So I'll try not to rush, and we'll see how that goes, see if I can slow myself down a little bit. I always like to start with this slide because, we know we've made incredible strides in recent years and recent decades and centuries, even from 1800 to 2015. But when you look at this chart, it's pretty clear. We haven't done much around mortality. Yeah, we're human beings, and yeah, we die. I mean, that's sort of the bottom line. We're mortal beings. None of us get out alive. Those are two of my favorite sayings. And just as we wish for and work hard towards having a good life, we can also seek a good death. And when I talk about a good death, sometimes people pull back from that. Well, what does that mean? I mean, we shouldn't be talking about that. And no, I think you have to, I think, not everybody does, but I think it's worthy to talk about what would be a good death. And one thing that became clear early on is there's no right, no wrong choices or answers here. It is really up to each of us to make these decisions for ourselves. And if we choose to, and we want to put in the homework, if you will, think about our values, et cetera, we can make some good choices. And if we have some luck along the way, we might get there. You could actually kind of get the kind of passing that you want to have. There's no guarantees, though, as we'll discuss. And it's interesting when you ask people, well, how do you think you might like to die? What looks okay to you? Most people, talk about that, I'd like it to be peaceful, and I certainly don't want any pain. I'd like to, be at home and like to be surrounded by loved ones. And I got to tell you, for those of us, and if I were in person, I'd ask you to raise your hands. How many of you read the obituaries every day? My guess is a few of you do, maybe looking for somebody or just being curious about people's lives. But you often see, so-and-so died peacefully at home, surrounded by loved ones. And when I see that, it warms my heart. It gives me a glow, because from my personal perspective, that's really as good as it gets. That's what I would want to choose. And most people feel that way. But the reality is that only about half the people achieve that kind of passing. We are making progress. When I started understanding these issues, it was really about 35 or 40% that actually had that kind of peaceful death. And I think it's now approaching 50%. And much of that is to hospice, and certainly we'll talk a little bit about hospice today, just as an alternative as we continue to age. But we have further to go. Far too many people still die in institutions, suffering, hooked up to machines, often isolated, with treatments that they may or may not wish to have. You know, most of us have had the experience of a friend or a loved one getting pulled into the medical care system towards the end of life, having operations, having treatments that get very technical and far advanced. And I must say, it's sometimes, in spite of all the efforts, difficult to pull back from that. Although, again, with hospice, more choices are available. But really what we're about, our new organization, and in general, these kinds of discussions, are reducing the disparity between what people say they think they would like and what actually takes place. And the basis of our ability to have some control over this is that we have a law, and all states now have a somewhat similar law. Ours was passed early on in the mid-1990s, and it's called the New Mexico Uniform Healthcare Decisions Act. And it was really very progressive at the time because it made it clear that each of us who have capacity, and we'll talk more about that, can decide what kind of healthcare we wish to have, and where do we want to get it, and when do we want to start it, and if and when do we want to stop it. Now, we all know that that's not a perfect equation, because sometimes insurance companies get in the way, and we pick plans that have limited providers, and you can't always go exactly to the specialist you might like. But in general, we have this right to self-determination about our healthcare and our healthcare decisions. The other very powerful piece that this Uniform Healthcare Decisions Act did was give us the right to appoint a surrogate or a proxy or a healthcare decision maker or a power of attorney for healthcare. Those are all reasonably synonymous terms for someone who's going to, that we trust and designate and they accept, who's going to work on our behalf and represent us if we lose capacity. Now, we could spend an hour talking about how you make that decision. In fact, I've done that with some groups, because there's a temptation to always say, well, my wife will do it, or my husband, or my oldest child, or, my best friend. It's not that easy. They often have the strongest attachments to keeping you alive, and you may or may not have that as your first choice, depending on what your situation is. And so you have to be very thoughtful about this appointment of a surrogate. What all of this does, it seems to me, is really give us the opportunity to have that good death that I spoke about earlier. As I said, there were no guarantees. We're all old enough and wise enough to know that life has its twists and turns, and we have our good days and bad days, and it doesn't always work out the way we think it should or that we would like it to. But the law here is generally on our side, and that's good to know going in. Again, it's up to us to choose to do the work. And now I'm going to raise issues, and really, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or write yourself a note so we can come back to them. I really want to make sure we have a pretty robust discussion because we have some time to do that today. So that right to self-determination is really the basis for advanced care planning. And I think many of you have heard that term. It's where you go through a process generally of thinking through your values about your healthcare and what it is that you might like or prefer in regards to how much treatment, how much pain and suffering, and or how much comfort care as you have choices that present over time. And what are your priorities about end of life, and what are these options? Broadly speaking, that's what advanced care planning is about. And it's certainly not something that you do once. You don't do it on your 75th birthday, hopefully. Although if you haven't done it, that's a good time to do it. But we like to think that people will do this as they're having major changes in their life. If they go off to college, they can be thinking about their issues and their parents, and having a conversation as a family. As you have a child, as you get married, as you have a child, all of these major milestones, the kind of milestones that you cover in your life book kinds of discussions, all of those are opportunities to be thinking about what's changed. And if you do this work, things do change and you have to make adjustments. So having the conversation after you think about it yourself, then you want to talk with your family and loved ones and healthcare providers and spiritual advisors, friends. I've learned how to have conversations about death and dying. And so, a lot of people just pull back from it. It's just a little uncomfortable. And maybe, we're going to bring bad juju if we talk about it. That's not the case. It really is empowering and helpful to have these discussions and just clear this air and help you get in touch with what your choices might be. And then in our society, it's helpful to complete some forms so that this, your thoughtfulness has a life of its own. And these are advanced directives. And these are forms that are put out generally by the state. In fact, in that Healthcare Decisions Act, Uniform Healthcare Decisions Act, there is a New Mexico form. And it's several pages. For right now, Christus has a form that they use that's very similar to that. There are other forms for advanced directives, and there's some marvelous resources. Our New Mexico law is very flexible. I've heard people say, if you're clearly stating it, you could write it on the back of a napkin or a menu and sign it, and you could take that to a clinician and it should be honored. Again, I would go with a more standard form than that, but I guess the point is that, look for a New Mexico form, but do the work however you decide to put it in writing. Through this form is also where you make your clear appointment of a healthcare decision maker. And that's another aspect of it. We also have I should have a picture of it and I don't for this talk, but there's a form called the New Mexico MOST, the Medical Order for Scope of Treatment, New Mexico MOST. And that's a form for people who are seriously ill, who have kind of a life-threatening condition of some kind. And it actually is signed both by the patient and their primary physician. And it really is a medical order then that states your priorities for whether or not you want to be resuscitated, whether or not you want to be transported to the hospital or not, kept in your home, whether or not essentially you should be allowed to die the death that you're having rather than taken and to the hospital for care. But it also is not just about that. You could say, absolutely, I want CPR. I want to go to the hospital. I want to get those drugs. I want every chance to live. So the forms itself, any of these forms, don't have an attitude towards them. It's up to you to bring your choices to them. And then we revisit these choices as life progresses. And again, this discussion of advanced care planning could be a whole day's workshop. So I realized about a year ago that I was talking and writing about end-of-life options as if everybody kind of knew what they were. And what I've come to appreciate is that's not the case. And I keep sort of refining this kind of list of how does this take place? And one that I don't have right here on the screen, but it happens far too often, is a sudden death. It could be getting hit by a truck or in a car crash, unanticipated death, a heart attack that takes the life. And we probably all have some familiarity with that, a gunshot, coming into your home from the street. I mean, there are ways that people just die suddenly. And then, it's perhaps somewhat easier. There's no choices to be made in that case, but it's awfully tough on the survivors, as you would anticipate. So I would say let's avoid that one if we can. But then there are people who say, let's let nature take its course. I don't really want to meddle with that. I have the trust in my faith, and I don't feel a need to do that. I respect that. Personally, I respect that kind of decision. And we've sort of seen those sometimes in indigenous cultures or movies where, the elder of the community will go off into the woods or go out on the iceberg and reflect that today's a good day to die. And the community understands that this is a natural part of the cycle, and, let nature take its course. But then there's others, many people, who are absolutely committed to the notion of longevity. They want to pursue life-sustaining treatments at all costs. And we've seen people, we know people who have taken 2 and 3 courses of radiation or chemo, or gone down to Mexico or to the Southeast Asia to get specialized treatments, or are on, go to Hopkins to get on trials, experimental kinds of pieces. That is absolutely wonderful if that's your preference and that's the way you choose to go. And these are folks that, again, I sort of make light of it a little bit, but, really want to fight for their last dying breath, and know that they've done everything they could in this lifetime to keep living. This next area of refusing treatment, I think, is often underappreciated, because as we start to have a tough diagnosis, and we start talking to the specialists and the subspecialists about what's next, most of us want to start. Nobody really wants to rush towards death at this point. But it is our right to decide which treatments and when. And it's fine to say, I don't want to start that. Another way, though, that refusing treatment comes into play is when you have been through a series of trials and treatments, and you perhaps get another kind of problem, a urinary tract infection, or that could be treated. You could just say, I'm really ready to go. I don't want that treatment. And that could hasten your death. That's just an option that sometimes is available to people, and sometimes people want to take that. No right or wrong. Certainly we can discontinue treatment. I've had enough. Let's stop this. It's ruining my life. I'd rather have this time be more graceful and peaceful for me. Those decisions about what care and how much, and do we want treatment or do we want comfort care, those are often helped by palliative care. And palliative care is a growing part of the medical care options, where you, having a serious diagnosis, can say, I'd like a palliative care consult. And these are specially trained nurses and clinicians and teams of people, social workers, who really specialize in understanding the relationship of complex medical problems around the interests of the patient, and sometimes extending that to the family, and making sure that they've got sort of a even-handed awareness of the pros and cons of different treatment options. Very valuable. They also can often work on medications that are conflicting and create problems for people, where this medication does this does this, the two together don't go well. These palliative care clinicians are skilled at being able to sort that out. Also, when to make the decision to get to hospice. Hospice is really only 30, 40 years old, and really in the last 2 decades has grown, because I think it was in the 90s or late 80s that it became a Medicare benefit. And it's one of those benefits that is a wraparound. Once you choose hospice, you're basically saying, I'm going to discontinue treatment, and I'm going to surround myself with comfort care, and I'm going to concentrate on having the best possible time remaining in my life. And these are services that are everything from spiritual support to pain control and various kinds of equipment for the home. In most cases, hospice is a service that is for people in their homes, although there are some hospice beds in hospitals. There are some hospice facilities where people can go and be a hospice home. Hospice is a critical part of our end of life. Anne, are you needing me for something?
I wanted to ask you the difference. I wanted to ask you the difference between palliative and hospice. Is palliative like before hospice and then,
No.
or is it the same?
No, it's a good question, and it takes a little time to answer. Palliative, they're not the same. Hospice is actually a comprehensive form of palliative care.
Okay.
But palliative consultations can come in at any time somebody has serious illness. I probably should separate them on this slide because I have created a little bit of confusion. A palliative consult is around the individual and helping them make these decisions, including whether or not hospice is a good step for them. And then all of hospice is palliative in its impacts. And that means that it reduces sort of the impacts of the disease and moves you towards comfort care.
And then I understand that hospice, like you said, is covered by Medicaid now, or Medicare.
Medicare and Medicaid,
Medicaid,
and it's a comprehensive benefit. There's nothing more that needs to be paid out of pocket,
Okay.
unless you want like private duty home care or private duty nursing to supplement. So another aspect, a way that some people choose to hasten death, and I think it's gaining actually an understanding and to some degree popularity, is voluntary stopping of eating and drinking, commonly called VSED. And this is where people who are towards the end of life and frail, but for one reason or another, depending on where they live, they don't have access to what I'm going to talk about next of medical aid in dying, or they choose not to take that kind of drug themselves. Many of you know that as you move towards the end of life, that eating and drinking can become less important, and that's part of the dying process is to pull back from the world as we know it. There's wonderful things written about this. Denise Cope from Santa Fe has written a terrific book called Dying: A Natural Passage about this dying process. But what we've learned about stopping eating and drinking is that it's best when it's part of a medical care activity. In other words, it should be medically supervised, and that's what helps people get through some of the tough challenges that may take place in the very first few days, or the dryness that may take place a few days later. Voluntary stopping eating and drinking, depending on the condition of the patient, is something that it's legal. It's something you can put in your advance directive, and it's something you can discuss with your providers and with hospice. And they will also often provide support, supportive care, comfort care, if you will, during that process. People can die from that, from stopping eating and drinking, if they're in a weakened condition in a matter of days or a week or 2 weeks. It can even go a little bit longer. Reportedly, it's not painful, although the dryness can be uncomfortable, but it can also be addressed medically. So again, it's out there. If you could Google VSED and get a lot of information. Continuous deep sedation is another one that is generally physician initiated for intractable pain or inability to breathe, air hunger, which is just incredibly frightening. And generally it's physician initiated, although often in the hospital or as part of hospice in some states. Basically it's sedating the patient to help them get through their pain or their inability to breathe. And it's legal, and sometimes it can lead to a hastened death because there's a very fine line as you get into coma about this sedation leading to death. But it has been accepted even by the Catholic Church as a legitimate effort to reduce suffering. So it's just something you need to know about that's out there, and you may get asked about whether this would be suitable for your loved one or even yourself. The difficult problem there is that the patient loses contact with their loved ones, perhaps, and that may be something that some want to avoid. And then medical aid in dying that I'm going to talk about next is our newest option here in New Mexico. But let me just mention that This stopping eating and drinking can also be part of a way to deal with dementia issues. Dementia is, again, could be another whole talk because it's with us and it's growing. And we need to, all of us be vigilant. And it's a tough challenge for the individuals and the caregivers. And some people say, I don't want to go down that road. What can I do? Well, certainly, as you'll learn, you can't use medical aid in dying because you lose capacity. But there may be ways, and it's being worked on legally now, that you can write a robust advance directive and give indication that when you reach a certain stage in your hospice progression, that you would choose to stop eating and drinking. And you could be supported in that on the basis that eating and drinking is really medication, and we can control what medications we take and don't take. I just put that out there as it's an area for development, because I know dementia issues are often, in front of all of us. The very final thing I'll mention, and you can Google it, and it's been around for a while. It's the Old Hemlock Society. It's where people figure out how to self-deliver. People who don't qualify for aid in dying or have conditions that are slow but terribly, terribly painful with lots of suffering, they can make a decision, a rational decision, for them about essentially a legal way to take their own life. Again, we could argue and talk for a long time about whether that's suicide and whether that's a bad thing or an okay thing. I just put it out there that there is a final exit network, and they're very thoughtful people, and you could take a look at what they have to say if you care to. Well, let me move on now and get to sort of, with that context, we're going to talk about Elizabeth Whitefield. Elizabeth Whitefield was a strong advocate. She is a family judge who was well known in the Albuquerque area. She had a terrible cancer and basically came to us to help us advocate for our End of Life Options Act. And in 2019, this was her giving testimony with her trach and her oxygen. And she looked a lot of those legislators in the eye and said, I need this, I really want this. And they knew her, she was well known. She didn't make it past the summer of 2018, and she had a very difficult death. And when it came to 2019 and we were ready to go into our law again, we knew that we wanted to honor her and name this bill in her behalf. So in the essence here, this is what it is. It's a medical practice wherein a healthcare provider prescribes medication to a qualified individual, and we'll talk about that, who may self-administer that medication to bring about a peaceful death. The law went into effect in June. And I'm not going to go into any detail here, but I did want to read this quote. We went to the courts first, starting in 2012. And we finally got to district court in Bernalillo County in December of 2013. And then she gave a ruling in January 2014. I'm going to read it out in case it's too small. This court cannot envision a right more fundamental, more private, or more integral to the liberty, safety, and happiness of a New Mexican than the right to a competent, terminally ill patient to choose aid and die. She ruled in our favor, and we were elated. We thought we were going to get this done. Only a year, 9 months later, appeals court voted 2-1 against that, and it went to the Supreme Court. And in 2016, the Supreme Court, we thought we would have their votes. They were an activist, pretty liberal court. They voted 5-0 against us and said, this is compelling, it's important, but it should be decided by the legislature, July 2016. As advocates, we knew what we needed to do. For the next 5 years, over 3 different sessions, we went to the Roundhouse with a bill, and support from many of you and support from all over the state as we did our outreach and our homework. And we lost by a close vote in the Senate in that very first year. 2019, our issue got conflated with the abortion issue, and it got very ugly and controversial. And we didn't even get to a floor vote. And then with the changes in the legislature in 2021, we got through the House, we passed the Senate, and with just a couple of amendments to the bill, and the governor signed it, and now it's in effect. So again, from an advocacy perspective, kind of a long journey, but a really positive one all the way. Well, let me just jump in now and talk a little bit about the bill and how this plays out. So the law is very clear, got to be a New Mexico resident, although we don't define that. We chose to keep that open and let that be a discussion between the prescribing provider and the patient. So you don't have to show a driver's license, you don't have to do this. You just have to, the provider just has to know that you're a resident, or they'll ask questions. So it's a little open-ended in that way, and that's the way we chose to have it. Have to be an adult. There was no way this was going to be something that was going to be available to children. You have to have a terminal illness, which means 6 months or less. And I want to expand on that. A terminal illness, a disease or condition that is incurable and irreversible and will, in accordance with reasonable medical judgment, lead to a death in 6 months. All of that is in the law. That's what qualifies you for medical aid in dying. And as we'll discuss, there are many people who can't meet that qualification who are suffering. And that's just part of what we live with in terms of the limitations of our bill. You must make the request for aid in dying must be voluntary. We do everything we can to ensure that there's no duress, nothing underhanded. You must be able to self-administer the drug. Now, self-administer was specifically chosen, and it talks about an affirmative, conscious, voluntary action to ingest the medication. And when we talk about ingest, that means it's got to go into the gastrointestinal tract. In other words, this will not be accomplished by IV. This will not be accomplished by a provider, providing the service, which again is what more the common definition of euthanasia, which is still in our country just forbidden. I mean, that's like the worst. We would not have gotten this bill passed, as opposed to our neighbors to the north in Canada, where they give people a choice. Do you want to do this yourself, or do you want the doctor to do it in an IV? And most people choose the latter, but so be it. We live in our country. And finally, you have to have capacity to make and communicate an informed decision. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But those are the basic qualifications. In terms of, and that's standard. The other 10 states that already have these laws, they all have that basic qualification. We didn't vary that in our bill. We did, however, make a variation here because of the rural nature of our state, and because what they call mid-level providers, advanced practice nurses and physicians assistants, have such a strong history here in New Mexico, and they have an ability to prescribe these medications. And in many of the rural areas, as well as some urban areas, they're primary providers. And we didn't want to take them out of the mix. So we have included them. Other states, we're the first ones to do that. Other states are now going back and trying to amend their bills to do that. As the note on the bottom says, in all cases, one of the compromises we made was that one physician, MD or DO, must determine after an appropriate examination that the individual is qualified. So if we have a nurse practitioner as a prescriber, it still requires a MD or DO to confirm that entire eligibility. The other thing that we did is in the last sentence, if the individual, the last two sentences, if an individual is enrolled in hospice, they are considered then to have a 6-month prognosis, because that's the qualification for getting, one of the qualifications for getting into hospice. We call it our hospice exception. And that allows somebody enrolled in hospice to move more quickly if they need to, and because they don't need a consulting clinician as long as their prescriber is an MD or DO. If they're not enrolled in hospice, then 2 providers must affirm the qualifications. And if you must.
No, I'm asking questions. So
right, in general, I'm going to wait to the end. But
Oh, okay.
because I don't want to, because I want to get through the material and then open it up.
Oh,
But if
okay.
you've got something pressing, okay. Hold that thought. Thank you. Because I'm sure others have questions as well. I hope so. Okay, so that's who can provide. And again, ours is a bit more progressive there than any of the other states. Then there's a discussion of capacity. And we make that in accordance with that Uniform Healthcare Decisions Act, which very clearly states that the underlying presumption is that an individual has capacity to make a healthcare decision. So in our bill, it's only if a clinician, the doc who's considering prescribing, or the nurse practitioner has a concern that there may be a lack of decisional capacity, or if there's a current or recent history of mental illness or disability. In that case, a referral to a mental health professional is required. And they must get that referral and get sort of a sign off from that mental health professional that they do have capacity. If they don't, they will not be eligible for medical aid in dying. But once again, we've defined mental health professional very broadly because of shortages that we have in our state. So it can be a psychiatrist, psychologist, MSW, psychiatric nurse practitioner, et cetera. We wanted to not have access to this law be a barrier to people stopping their suffering. So what does a provider need to do? They must inform the individual who's requesting about all their options. And it says in the bill, including palliative care and hospice, which are two of the main alternatives towards ending your life. We want to make sure that people know enough to be able to make this kind of dramatic decision. And that's part of the responsibility of a prescribing provider. All the documents must document all the qualifications in the medical record. And in the bill itself, there is a form. It's a request to end my life in a peaceful manner, and it must be completed and signed by the individual and witnessed by two persons, one who is an uninterested party, and then it must go in the record. That form is so explicit. It makes it very clear. I understand my diagnosis. I understand that I have less than 6 months to live. I understand that if I take these medications, that I will likely die within several hours, although it could take longer. I do this on my own free will and volition. And in each of those cases, people initial and then they sign at the end. We want there to be no mistakes here. And then there is some basic reporting to the state of New Mexico, to the Department of Health. And there's a whole series of other provisions in this Elizabeth Whitefield bill. Separate from the aid in dying, we've created a requirement that with any serious illness or a terminal diagnosis, that your provider should be discussing all their options. All the things that we discussed are supposed to be discussed with the patient by their provider, even if they're not interested in aid in dying. We want people to know about their options. That's going to take longer to implement. Some clinicians do that and do it well. Many of them aren't that comfortable with it. And we're going to have to help them understand over time that this is now a requirement, that patients have their options explained. The bill is very clear because it's part of what gets difficult about passing this law. The opponents feel like this is suicide, and suicide is a bad thing in all cases. Medical aid in dying is not suicide. That language is absolutely explicit in the bill. It's not homicide, it's not neglect, it's not manslaughter. It's a part of medical care, but explicitly it's not suicide, because suicide also would have implications for insurance and other kinds of benefits that people may have or their families may have after they die. The bill also has strong immunity protections and a strong conscience clause. And it protects not only the providers, but it also protects the families and anybody else who assists, and anybody that provides the service and anybody that chooses not to provide the service. Medical aid in dying is entirely voluntary for all parties involved. And that's a fundamental precept of this bill across the country. This is absolutely voluntary on everybody's part, and we protect people for either participating or not participating. Now, if you're a hospice or a hospital or a long-term care center, and you decide you don't want to participate, that information must be publicly acknowledged and posted on a website and in your materials. And you are obligated to provide a referral and transfer medical records. So all of this is very patient-centered. So that's the guts of the bill. And as you can imagine, this is new to New Mexico. We may have a few providers and some people in the state that came from Oregon or Washington or Colorado or California now or Vermont who know about this. But by and large, most providers don't. So our group of advocates who worked so hard to get the bill passed made a decision in April that we felt a responsibility to organize more formally, become a 501c3 nonprofit, and to go ahead and do what some of the other states have done, not all, but some, and create an organization that will help not only the implementation of aid in dying, but more broadly assist in having more people have the kind of death they seek through advanced care planning, through understanding their rights, through understanding their options. So this is our brochure, and I think there's a copy posted. So how's it going in the first 4 or 5 months? There's lots of interest and inquiries. Our website has been incredibly busy. We've upgraded our website tremendously in the last 2 months. It's been a lot of work and some dollars to do that. We've actually had a good number of ingestions. I say good means that it's higher than we thought it would be. And we only learn about them informally. Sometimes we're involved in helping with referrals. Nobody has to report to us. But we know of over 24 ingestions taking place in various parts of the state, several along the Rio Grande corridor down south, one out towards Gallup, one up in Farmington, some in Santa Fe, one up in Taos, that kind of thing. So it is something that people seek at times, and we're helping people have the kind of a peaceful death that results. But we're all on a learning curve. There's a lot that people don't know. We have clinicians that and hospices that are still learning about it. But we also have some hospice agencies that have fully incorporated aid in dying into their scope, including prescribing. And that really simplifies the process for those in that kind of hospice. Other hospices are not prescribing with their medical director or mid-levels, but are providing support services all the way up through the ingestions that are generally done in the home. And then the bereavement services and the dealing with the deceased body. Those are things that hospice does all the time, and many of them are participating. But we also have some hospices that have put up their notice that they're not going to participate. And if you really want aid in dying potentially, you might want to choose another hospice for your time. In terms of the large systems of care, Presbyterian Healthcare Services with its 7 hospitals is supportive, has developed an excellent internal data collection and approval process and training. We're still hoping more of their clinicians will come on board, but slowly that's happening. The UNM Health Sciences Center was slow on the uptake, but now they've accomplishing their training and they're starting services this past month, at least for their own patients, not necessarily thus far for referrals. And Christus, and we can talk about this, is very clear, as you would expect from a Catholic-based hospital. They are not going to participate in aid in dying on their premises, but they are committed to excellence in end-of-life care. They talk about their enhanced palliative care program. I personally took over 300 brochures so that they could use our brochures as they refer patients who show interest. And I think Christus is going to do a good job, and we will find where in the community to help people get the service if they're looking for. So far, our organization, and as far as we know, people have been able to get access to aid in dying as they request it. And our little nonprofit, we've got subcommittees that are building our programs for clinical outreach and education. We'll also be providing individual support and referrals, as we said, and in some cases in other states, that includes bedside work at the time of ingestion, if requested. It's all by request. We'd welcome your support, and on our new website, we even have a very smooth functioning donate button for those of you that might be motivated out there. And I guess I'm obligated to, my other board members always say I need to make that plug. But no, if we're going to sustain, as we all know, nonprofits need support, and so be it. Getting to my last slide now is what can you do? Please think it through for yourself a bit, do some reading, have the conversation to clarify your values. What matters to you around all of this, if anything? If it doesn't really matter, you can let it go. Create or review your advanced directives and your end-of-life planning documents. My guess is many of you have them, but you may not, A, know where they are, or B, maybe haven't looked at them in the last 3, 4, 5 years. Use this as just a good opportunity. Thanksgiving's coming, family will be around. This is something that you can talk about. Make sure that you appoint a really good surrogate who can represent your interests in the way that you want them to. It's up to you to make sure they understand your wishes. And even though you cannot include aid in dying in an advanced directive, because it has to be done now, it has to be your own volition at the moment, and you cannot delegate this to a surrogate. If this is something that you might consider, you should be preparing your loved ones sooner than later, that this is just sort of how you see it. And you don't want to suffer at the end, and you don't perhaps value longevity as much as sort of a good passing peacefully, perhaps surrounded by family. Again, I don't know if there's a way to sort of put this in the chat. These are all excellent resources. Compassion and Choices. We have many donors to Compassion and Choices. They have been fabulous partners with us. They have helped us with staff. They have worked on our materials together. They are excellent national group. Death with Dignity National Center, equally so. They have funded us to upgrade our website. For the clinicians, if there are any of you out there, this ACAMAID, Clinicians Academy on Medical Aid in Dying, it's about 2 years old, and it is where the collective knowledge and wisdom is being developed about the clinical aspects of aid in dying. And they are have a listserv, they've got materials, they've got films, they've got CEs, terrific resource. And then my favorite advanced directive activity is the Conversation Project with wonderful materials. So some good resources. And I think it's now I've gone over maybe just a few minutes, but we've got a nice bit of time. We'll have some Q&A. And again, thanks for being here, and may the journey be good to you. And don't hesitate to be in touch. You know, I've made it clear to Anne that as any of our villagers are going through choices or facing tough decisions, you know, we have people who can be helpful, including myself, who are there for that purpose. So do not hesitate. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see your wonderful faces again, and get a sip of tea and turn it. Maybe we can unmute folks, or at least those who have questions, and you can unmute and take it over from here.
Barak. It's been great. We have questions in the chat. So why don't we let you stop for just a second? Yes, and get a drink of tea or water. But just to let you know, we are recording this session. It will be up tomorrow or the next day at the latest on villagesofsantafe.org. And I will also put up links to some of the other things that we have discussed here, including the New Mexico MOST and some advanced care directives. But I think that we really appreciate this. It's just wonderful to be able to, you know, get down to the brass tacks. But, you know, for example, one of the things I know that, like you talked about Christus opting out, how, and it sounds like something that we really need a situation to know how to initiate this conversation with our physician. And also then if that physician opts out, how to find one, because this is something like you said, you can't do now. You have to have it done within a certain time frame. And so, but it seems like you could have the conversation now with the physician and find the physician.
That is absolutely terrific advice. I had my annual physical 2 weeks ago. And I've been talking to my PA, Danny Mays, for years about this. He knows where I'm coming from, but they hadn't committed as a practice. And it's a big practice with 3 docs and a number of mid-levels. And I brought him the materials. I brought him a brochure. And I said, Danny, it's time. Are you guys going to participate? Or do I have to start looking elsewhere? And we had a good discussion, and he was going to take it to his boss and the rest of the practice. This is the time to be finding out whether it's medical aid in dying or other, that's not the only choice. It's really, will your clinician, your primary provider, willing to work with you around end of life issues? And do they have boundaries for themselves that you should know about? So I think this is the right time to be asking those questions so that we can all make the kind of choices to be supported when we get to that situation.
So also we have, let's see, how do you address the issues of perhaps family members who do not agree with your decision to participate in medical aid in dying? Yeah,
terrific question. And it goes really back to that Uniform Healthcare Decisions Act. This is really not about what the family wants. This is a place where we honor ourselves. We get to make these decisions. And that's why I think the earlier you have the conversation, there's time to deal with their resistance or their concerns about it. But ultimately, the clinician is going to look to you, not to, if you have capacity. If you don't have capacity, and you haven't designated someone to represent you, a proxy or a surrogate, then it will go to the family. And there's an order prescribed: spouse, oldest child, that's in the law. And so New Mexico is one of those states that actually has a listing if there's nobody designated and the patient loses capacity, of what that'll be. So yeah, these are your decisions to make. This is patient-centered stuff.
And then I think you had a discussion talking about like Oregon and other places that people frequently will, let's say, opt into this, but then they actually don't use the drugs. They are fine with it's just kind of maybe a level of comfort that if their pain and suffering gets too much, they have that option. But what do you see as the percentage, or is there a number on that?
Well, we actually have very good data on all of this, because we've had 50 years of experience between 22 or 3 in Oregon and 15 or so in Washington, and then newer states, 50 years of experience. And the data from state to state is very similar. And basically the data reflects that about a third, 35% to 40% of the people who acquire the medications, who get approved, do not end up taking them. And there could be a variety of reasons. It could be that their dying process isn't that bad, not as bad as they thought it would be, or they die before they can take it, can come on them suddenly. But for many people, and we heard this time and time again in the testimony, it's really the peace of mind that knowing that this option is there can bring for people who are suffering or have these very tough terminal diagnoses. It's just an option that's there if things go south. And that feels very important to people, and younger people who have a terrible diagnosis in their 40s and know they're going to live with it hopefully for a while. They say that knowing this is there allows them to live their life as fully as possible in the interim. So I think you're absolutely right that whoever wrote the question, yeah, it's peace of mind. And it also, because there are conversations like these that go on and with providers, we also find in those states that have this law that people get into hospice a bit earlier because they're making these decisions more proactively, and that the level of access to palliative care is earlier and more frequent. Now, not every place has palliative care yet. It's growing. We're blessed that we do have some here in Santa Fe and Albuquerque and in several other areas, and we're trying to grow the ability of palliative care to be involved. Any questions out there, folks?
Yes.
Go ahead. Yeah, I see Karen.
Karen, mute yourself.
I think you have to unmute, Karen. We all struggle with that.
Sorry.
Always, always.
Sorry. If a person is living with severe pain, but cannot qualify for the 6-month terminal illness, what are the options?
Right. Again, depending on the rest of their conditions, I mean, again, I would start with a palliative care consult to be sure that everything is being done for that pain that can possibly be done. That's what palliative care is about. But there are types of pain and conditions where it's intractable. They can't overcome it with drugs over time. And then other options such as sort of stopping treatment, letting the condition get worse, stopping eating and drinking to hasten death, or perhaps even requesting of a provider this palliative sedation, this long-term sedation that sometimes can hasten death, but as a minimum, with the kind of drugs that they use, absolutely can stop the pain because they're going to basically put you into heavily sedated condition.
Thank you.
Sure.
Lorraine, you had a question?
I just was still a little bit confused about palliative care and whether Christus allows that.
I appreciate you raising it. Absolutely. Christus has an entire palliative care team, and they've had it now for a number of years. And that as people get a difficult terminal diagnosis or they're reaching a point of crisis, that palliative care team, social work, nurse, clinicians, they will come to be and participate with the family and the patient and the other providers to figure out the best course of action that the patient or the surrogate or the family, if there's no surrogate, wishes. So yes, very much they're very supportive of palliative care. They're supportive of all end-of-life options, except they draw their line at this medical aid in dying, and then they will refer. And
thank you. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question.
Madeline, you had a question? I think I can read it for you. So when a typical course of terminal illness is longer than 6 months, like Alzheimer's, and when competent, that person completes the necessary paperwork, will it be honored when the person is no longer competent?
Right. Again, a very good question that arises all the time. What's unique about this aid in dying is the need and the requirement of competency as you make the request and as you write up to the self-administration needs to be done by somebody who has the wherewithal to know what they're doing. Now, so the answer is no, you cannot put medical aid in dying into an advance directive. You could say, if I ever get to that point, I and I'm still confident that I might be open to choosing it. And that way you have that conversation with your family and your provider. They know where you're coming from, but they would not be able to prescribe you the lethal medications if you have if there's any concern about the capacity. And that's where, as I sort of shared to Karen and during the talk, you'd have to, basically decide other things. I had a friend whose mom was rapidly descending into dementia issues, memory care center, couldn't be cared for at home. And they were just at wit's end because they knew that their mom had never wanted to prolong life, had always been clear about her directives, did not want to suffer, did not want to be anybody else. And my friend was just, what do I do? And I said, and besides now, the friend has said, she now has a terrible urinary tract infection. And I said, there's always an option of not treating it and letting it go to sepsis, managing it with comfort care, but ultimately that will hasten death. Those are very tough decisions, and I don't say them lightly, but if you're the surrogate and you know what your person, your loved one wants, and you've had the conversations, some people just choose not to descend into the realm of not knowing who they are or their loved ones if they can avoid it. I think in all fairness, other people and the experiences, if people aren't violent and if they're well cared for, it may be fine for them to become someone else. And even if they are not any longer recognizing loved ones, they can have a pretty good life, perhaps different, albeit than the life that they had. So again, not to make value judgments. One of our premises of our nonprofit is that we are non-judgmental. It's really about what each individual sees for themselves.
Thank you. This is great. So we have any other questions? You can put them in the chat box or just unmute yourself and ask Barak. Again, all this information will be up on it. Most of it's on our website, but the recording will be up this afternoon or tomorrow. And we do appreciate everybody being involved in this. It was a great discussion. I think we could sit down and, like Barak, we've talked about, all the other things we've done, our life books and everything like that. You can pretty much spend a full day doing this, just
Sure.
going through the forms and making sure they're all filled out. But this gives us some really great options, another great option. And it's a good thing to think about and to have that discussion with everyone.
Right. This is really sort of this medical aid in dying is really kind of a somewhat of a last resort. I mean, most people, the data is, even in Oregon, where they've had 20 years of history, it's less than 0.5% that use this. And of that, 35% never take the medications.
Mhm.
So it's not something that people are rushing out to do. It's just an option that gives us another choice and an ability to have these kinds of discussions so that ultimately we can have the kind of passing that we choose to have.
I
Well,
thought really important, so I appreciate it. And if you have any other further questions, you can always email Barak, and I think his contact information is up on our website. So
yeah, but let's make sure of that. And again, don't hesitate to be in touch if you think of something later. I think we've already talked about some of the wonderful, wonderful books on related subjects of aging well and dying well. There's a lot out there. For me personally, it's just been such a privilege to learn and to grow and listen around these issues, but it's also self-serving. Like many of you, I've been blessed with, a pretty damn good life. And, I'd like to go out in the way that I care to if it works out that way. So it's self-serving in that regard, as most of what we do kind of one way or another is. But again, thanks for your time and attention today. It's an honor, and I'm pleased to be part of Villages, and hope we can have that Christmas party.
Hey, I'm hanging in there.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed it, and be sure to log in and send your friends to our website so they can review that if they
Yeah.
live here in New Mexico. Even if
Yeah.
they don't, if they live in a state that they're thinking about what could they do, it really is important. My nephew's mother-in-law died of ALS quite quickly, and she was living in a state, and they actually got her to move to Oregon so they could help her.
Yeah. No, our website now has tremendous information on it. It didn't used to, because it was one for advocacy. Now it's really a service website, and we're very proud of it. We'll keep improving the content, but you'll find a lot on there about all of these issues, and links to other places. So really do visit the website, and if you hit the donate button, that'd be fine.
Donut button.
Right. A donut. That's what we need. We need a donut button.
There you go. You donate, you get a donut.
There you go. I like it. Thank you all so
Thank
much.
you all. Bye. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
so
much.
much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.